Hi everyone, I'm Zach Rubin, and we're here today with Jamil Zaki, who will be sharing his fascinating research on empathy. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jamil, on this important but often overlooked topic. There is going to be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so if you have anything you'd like to ask Jamil, please just click the Ask a Question link in the resources section of the page. I'll give a little bit of background as way of introduction, and then Jamil can take it away. Jamil is the director of Stanford's Social Neuroscience Lab, and he's the author of the popular book, The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World. If you're interested in the book, the link is in the resources section of the page. And Jamil's fascinating work explores how levels of empathy are eroding in society, and that has significant consequences on the way we all interact with each other. And his research also provides hope for how empathy can be developed and learned by individuals and groups. And empathy is a key trait in the success of leaders, managers, parents, and individuals. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamil to explore this further with us.
Great. Thanks, Zach, for the introduction. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope that you find this useful and interesting. I'm going to talk about some ideas that I've been mulling over for many years about why empathy is so important, why it's become more difficult, and how we can work on empathizing even when it doesn't come naturally to us. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. I'm only going to talk for about 30 minutes, so I look forward to hearing your thoughts. I also want to highlight that, unfortunately, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so I apologize if I'm overhydrating or cough a little bit along the way, so please bear with me. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, like way back in the beginning, let's say 50 or even 100,000 years ago, to a time when people weren't really that impressive a species. At that point, we were just medium-sized mammals, not particularly fast or strong. We couldn't fly, and we weren't even the only smart species on the planet. At that time, we shared the Earth with at least 5 other large-brained human species. But sapiens had one thing that set us apart, and that was each other. More than any other animal, we collaborated, worked together, and cared for one another, and that made all the difference. Because even if, as individuals, we were unimpressive, as a collective, we were breathtaking and could do things no other animal could ever dream of. It was by working together that we took over the world. But what allows people to work together so effectively? Well, psychologists and neuroscientists have recently pinpointed one engine for human kindness and cooperation. And that's the weird and wonderful fact that even though we are physically separate from each other, people psychologically overlap. That sense of overlapping can be so intense that sometimes when you see someone experience something, it feels like you, not they, are the ones going through it. In case you haven't had that experience lately and aren't scared of heights, if you are, you can toggle to another screen. Here's a guy walking across the Grand Canyon. Now, the funny thing is that you and me and all of us are sitting or standing on relatively solid ground, in no danger of plummeting to our doom. But if you're anything like me, just watching this, you might feel your palms start to sweat. You might feel a little bit nervous or anxious, as though it were you on the wire, not him. What you're experiencing is a primitive form of what we call empathy, people's emotional connections to each other. Now, the type of empathy you just went through, sort of vicariously sharing other people's emotions, is not uniquely human. All sorts of other animals share each other's pain. Among the ones just that we've measured include apes, non-human primates, monkeys, rats, mice, dolphins, elephants, even some birds. But in humans, empathy has taken an evolutionary quantum leap. We empathize more broadly and more deeply than any other animal, and our empathy is more complicated too. In fact, human empathy is not one thing at all. It's an umbrella term for multiple ways that we connect with other people. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're having lunch with a friend and he gets a phone call. You don't know who's on the other line or what they're saying, but you can tell it's not good because your friend begins to cry. Well, as you watch him break down, a bunch of stuff might happen in you. First, you might feel bad yourself, vicariously sharing his emotions, which we would call emotional empathy. You might also try to understand what he's feeling and why, which we would call cognitive empathy. And at least if you're a decent friend, you probably care about what your pal is going through and want him to feel better, which we would call empathic concern or compassion. These pieces together make up the full range of human empathy. Now, you can think about your own level of empathy. You can also think about sort of the collective empathy of everybody in this class, or everybody in your town, or everybody in this country as the human equivalent of a natural resource. And it is a precious one. As I said, empathy might be one of the keys that allowed humanity to thrive in the first place. And decades of evidence demonstrate that it continues to help all sorts of people, including people who feel it. So individuals who are high versus low in empathy, for instance, tend to be happier and have an easier time forming and keeping important relationships in their life. They tend to suffer less stress and depression, and they tend to be more successful in professional contexts. Empathy's benefits, of course, bubble outward. So patients of empathic physicians are happier with their care and more likely to listen to doctors' orders. Employees of empathic managers are less likely to call in sick with stress-related illness. And spouses of empathic partners, maybe unsurprisingly, are happier in their marriages. But maybe empathy's most important role is in stitching together and maintaining broader communities. Empathic individuals are more likely to do things like donate to charity or volunteer, and even inspiring someone to feel empathy for just a moment makes it more likely that they'll step in and help a stranger. Empathy also makes it less likely that we will see others through the lenses of stereotyping and prejudice, and more likely that we'll be open-minded to people who look or think differently from ourselves. And finally, empathy helps us sort of care for future generations, for instance, by becoming interested in environmental sustainability. So this is great. The most empathic animal on the planet took it over. We must be living in an empathic golden age, sitting together in a global circle, holding hands and singing together. Wait, well, that's not it at all, though, is it? That's not what life feels like sometimes. Empathy is hard, and I would argue that it's getting harder. To see why, let's return to our ancient friends here and think about what life was like when human empathy first evolved. Well, at that time, people existed mostly in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers, each one just a few families apiece. What that meant is that if you ran into somebody else, probably a bunch of things were true. You were likely familiar with each other and maybe even related to each other. You were visible to each other. You could see pain and pleasure on each other's faces, hear it in each other's voices. And you were accountable to one another. You knew each other's history of kindness and unkindness and could pay it back in return. These parts of social life are what I call empathy's primordial soup, ingredients that make it natural and easy for us to care for one another. But I would also argue that these pieces of social life are increasingly disappearing from our modern context, because the way that we live now is totally different than the way that we did back then in all kinds of ways. For one, we're more atomized and isolated than we were before. In 2007, humanity crossed a remarkable line. For the first time, more people lived inside cities than outside of them. This is a rapid trend. So in 1950, about 1/3 of humanity was urban. But by 2050, that number will be 2/3. What that means is that recently, the average human woke up in a place like this, maybe a small town, where everybody knew everybody. But increasingly, and into the future, we'll be waking up in places that look like this, huge cities where we're surrounded by millions of other people. But being surrounded by people is not the same as knowing them. Because the rise in urban living has been tagged with another huge trend towards solitary living. More people live alone than ever in human history. This is especially true among young people. So in the US, 18 to 34-year-olds are 10 times more likely to live alone than they were just 100 years ago. What that means is that in a real way, humanity is alone in a crowd. We see more people than ever, but no fewer of them. And even the rituals that used to bring us into regular contact, everything from bowling leagues to grocery shopping, have given way to solitary pursuits often carried out online. What that means is that when we run into each other, when we do interact with people, it's often in ways that are thinned out, anonymous, and transactional. This is not great soil for empathy, and it feeds into another modern trend, which is our tendency to be tribal. That is, to split the world into us and them, and lavish praise on people who are like us, while treating people who are unlike us with scorn, contempt, and suspicion. Tribalism is not new. It's as old as tribes. That's how it got its name. And it characterizes all sorts of interactions, everything from sports fandom to ethnic and international conflict. But for reasons we can talk about later if you like, tribalism is on the rise. And that's terrible news for empathy, because in tribal contexts, empathy doesn't just disappear, it reverses into what we could call Schadenfreude, or enjoying other people's pain. I think of politics in the US and abroad these days as something like a Schadenfreude buffet. You can go online or outside or anywhere really and find people who seem less interested in advancing their own position and more interested in finding people who disagree with them and making those people hurt, causing them pain, and then savoring their pain, for instance, drinking up their tears. Now, the third sort of piece of modern life that I think has been difficult for empathy will not surprise many of you. Heck, we're in a technologically mediated experience right now, and increasingly, that's how we interact, not in person, but online. We might not see our friends that much in day-to-day life, or at least as much as we did before, but we can see them all the time in these massive online social networks. I think of social networks as humanity's greatest empathic opportunity of all time. We can meet other people anywhere, at any time, anywhere on the planet, on our own terms and respond with empathy. But I think few of us would argue that social networking has lived up to that promise, because the way that social networks are built might not give us the cues that we need to really connect with each other at a deep level. It feels in some ways like we can connect with anybody, but can't really connect with anybody at the same time. For one, many social networks deprive us of the cues that we use to empathize. So for instance, whereas in an analog hangout, we might be able to see each other's faces and hear each other's voices, online, we're often instead reduced to anonymous avatars and strings of text. My friend Juliana Schroeder at Berkeley has done some really interesting work on what that does to our empathy. In one set of studies, she had people read their political opinions out loud. She then had other people either listen to the first group of people's opinions, hear their voices, or read a transcript of what those people had said. And what she found was that when people read someone's transcript instead of hearing their voice, they were more likely to dehumanize that person, viewing them as less than a full human being, especially if they disagreed with them already. Other social media platforms encourage us to display our least empathic sides. So researchers at NYU and Yale have looked at hundreds of thousands of tweets. And what they find is that when people express outrage in tweets, they're more likely to be rewarded, for instance, with more likes and retweets, especially from people who agree with them already. And what that causes people to do is to sort of respond to those little doses of social reinforcement by expressing more outrage in their later tweets. So in essence, social media, or the way that we're encouraged to behave online, is to not really see people who are different from us, and in fact, to rage against them to receive rewards from the people who are already in our tribes. I guess a way of summing all of this up is that empathy is built for a world in which we are familiar to each other, interconnected, and aligned. And now more than ever, we're anonymous, isolated, and tribal. In fact, if you wanted to build a system to break human empathy, you could scarcely do better than we have. And in fact, there is evidence that in some ways empathy has broken. So here, I'll show you the most common way people measure empathy. It's just a questionnaire, a series of statements, and you're asked to tell us how well each statement describes you, from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely. I'll give you 2, and you can try it out on your own. Here's the first. I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. So you can think about how well that describes you. Here's another. I try to look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision. So these plus 26 other items would give you an empathy score from 1 to 5. This test was developed in the 1970s, and since then, hundreds of thousands of people have completed it. More recently, psychologists decided to put these data together, and the news was not great. So here I'll show you the average American's empathy score in 1979. It's a 4 out of 5. Not bad, a solid B. Here it is again in 2009, a 3 out of 5. That is a big drop. To put it in perspective, the average American in 2009, at least according to themselves, less empathic than 75% of Americans just 30 years before. So maybe this study is shocking to you, or maybe it's the opposite of shocking. Maybe you don't feel like you need a study to tell you this. I know for me, it's been a really interesting experience. Studying empathy for the last 15 years, sort of my job has been to document how empathy works. And in particular, I've found so many ways that it helps us and helps us help each other. But at the same time, as I've been documenting its benefits, as a person, I've noticed all sorts of trends that seem to be pushing back against empathy, like political polarization, an epidemic of stress and anxiety among young people. It's felt a little bit like being a psychologist studying empathy is like being a climate scientist studying the polar ice. We discover the benefits of something, the necessity of something, just as it disappears all around us. God, that's bleak, huh? But we're not out of time yet. And so I want us to spend the rest of our time thinking about a deep question, which is, does it have to be this way? Must we accept that as our culture continues to change, as we continue to become more urban and more techified, as we will, that we will also necessarily become less empathic, more callous, more disconnected, even more cruel? Or can we push back against these trends and try to reclaim our empathy, try to rebuild our common humanity? Well, I think that the answer to this question depends on how we answer an even more basic question, which is, can we control our empathy at all? I think that the sort of standard wisdom on this has been, no, we can't control our empathy because it's often viewed as a trait, something that you're born with and either have or don't have. Now, I call this the Roddenberry Hypothesis, and I'm going to embarrass myself now and kind of out myself as a huge dork, but maybe someone on the line shares this. I call it the Roddenberry Hypothesis because Gene Roddenberry enshrined this idea into the greatest television show of all time, Star Trek: The Next Generation. Hopefully there's at least one other Trek fan, Trekkie, here on the call with me. But anyways, On one side, we have the ship's counselor, Deanna Troi, known throughout the galaxy for her high levels of empathy. She naturally shares other people's emotions and as a result can instinctively tell what other people are feeling. On the other side, we have Lieutenant Commander Data, an android who can't feel emotions himself and as a result is colorblind to the feelings of others. Now, crucially, neither of these characters has much say in the matter. Deanna Troi is a betazoid. Her preternatural empathy is baked into her genes. And Data's lack of empathy is literally programmed into his sort of artificial brain. So I think the Roddenberry hypothesis, both in the show and throughout our sort of culture, hold that if you think of a continuum defined by these two characters, well, each of us has some level of empathy somewhere between them. And just like the color of our eyes or our adult height, where that level is with us to stay. We were born there and will die there. Now, if you are really empathic, well, good for you. The Roddenberry hypothesis means that you are bound to benefit from empathy and the people around you are too. But if you're less empathic, this is terrible news because it means that no matter what you do or how hard you try, you'll never get better at connecting with people. It's even worse news for our culture writ large because it means that if modern life is making empathy harder, there's nothing we can do to overcome those barriers either. Now, this is a fatalistic view, but thankfully it's also wrong. I want to tell you about a new view of empathy that my colleagues and I have been working on. It's the subject of my book, but it's actually, to me, not that new because it defined a bunch of my childhood. It turns out that in the 1970s, Washington State University offered scholarships to students from the world's poorest nations. My mom got the scholarship from Peru, and my dad did not get a scholarship. He was not as good a student as my mom, but he nonetheless went to Washington State from Pakistan. They flew from Lima and Lahore, two giant cities, to the sleepy town of Pullman, where they fell in love, looking extremely 1970s in the process. But for them, it was not meant to be. When I think about my parents, even now, I think the biggest thing that they had in common was their sense of foreignness in the US. Uncomfortable in their new homes, they found comfort in each other. But as they acclimated to the US, now they've been here for almost 50 years, I think they realized how little they had in common, which, as their kid, I can tell you, is very little. So, I mean, they started divorcing when I was 8, but didn't finish until I was 12. And I'm their only child, and I was sort of the bridge between their worlds. I spent a lot of my childhood bouncing back and forth between their houses. But maybe if any of you are children of divorce, this is familiar. I actually felt more like I was bouncing back and forth between parallel universes. When I was with my mom, I had to try to figure out what she cared about and care about it too. But when I reached my dad's house, those same rules stopped working and I had to recalibrate. It was hard emotional labor for an 8-year-old. And I think for a while, all of us, all three of us, felt that I would have to pick one parent and kind of give up on really knowing the other one. But I knew that for the sake of all of us, I had to keep trying, and I did. And eventually, it got easier. I learned to tune myself to my parents' different emotional frequencies and managed to keep a connection with each of them, even as their connection to each other disintegrated. I would say that empathy saved me, but not because it came naturally. I think of my parents' divorce as an empathy gym for me, because it forced me to work at care and understanding. And it was that work and the benefits that it brought to me and my family that made me interested in this topic in the first place. In the many years since, I've discovered tons of evidence that contradicts standard wisdom, but jibes with my own childhood experience. Because it turns out that empathy is not just like a trait, it's also like a skill. By this, I don't mean that empathy has no genetic component, because it does. But the way I think of it is that our genes might dictate where we begin, but not where we end up. Our experiences change the way that we empathize. Some might cause our empathy to atrophy, but other experiences can cause it to grow. And crucially, this means that we can choose our experiences, make choices, and cultivate habits that help us empathize more effectively. You make those choices all the time, whether you know it or not. Will you cross the street to ignore or avoid a homeless person? Or will you pay attention to what they're going through? Will you tune out somebody who you disagree with or try to be curious about where they're coming from? When we make choices over and over again to connect, I think we can turn empathic moments into empathic habits and eventually become more empathic people. So if my parents' divorce was an empathy gym for me, I see my work now as creating empathy gyms for other people, places where they can go to get a little bit better at caring and understanding. I want to share with you just a few insights that I've collected from that work. The first is if you want to cross boundaries between us and them, you can begin by returning to you and I. One of the tragic things about tribalism is that it makes us profoundly incurious about people who are different from ourselves. We stop seeing them as people and start seeing them as just members of a group. But that type of stereotyping is really difficult to do close up because people are hugely complicated and idiosyncratic, and no one can be reduced to just one part of their identity. So, what researchers have found over and over again is if we focus on individuals and their experiences, we come to empathize more easily with folks who are different from ourselves. In collaboration with Stanford's Virtual Reality Lab, I've tried a high-tech approach to this to build empathy. So we used virtual reality simulations to build empathy for people who don't often receive it, homeless people in the Bay Area. So in this study, our participants went through a simulation of what it might be like to become homeless in a series of scenes. In one scene, they had been evicted from their apartment and were trying to sell their furniture to make ends meet. In a second scene, they're living in their car, which is impounded. And in a final scene, they've taken to a local bus line for shelter. I should say all of these scenes were drawn from interviews with homeless individuals in the area. This was a short simulation, just 15 minutes, but we found that it had long-lasting effects. In particular, compared to people in a control condition, people who went through this VR simulation, even a month later, were less likely to dehumanize homeless individuals and more likely to support policies in favor of affordable housing. But thankfully, we don't need like an Oculus Rift or other high-tech devices to understand the experiences of individuals who are different from us. Lots of evidence demonstrates that if we, for instance, read fiction or attend theater where the characters come from groups that are different from us, we can build empathy for real people in those groups. And even better, cultivating diverse friendships with people who are different from ourselves helps us broaden our empathy in the same way. A second insight that I want to share with you is that caring is contagious. I mean, in fact, all sorts of things are contagious in psychological life because people are like the most conformist animal on the planet. We do and think and feel and dress and act the way that other people around us do, which can be tragic when things like bullying or drug abuse spread through our social networks. But the good news is that positive behaviors can be just as contagious as negative ones. In my own work, I found that when people believe that others around them are empathic, they're more likely to empathize and act kindly as well. More recently, my colleagues and I decided to try to use this insight and leverage the power of conformity to build kinder cultures among the most conformist people on earth, seventh graders. It's true. Middle schoolers really are more conformist by age than any other group. So we worked with middle schoolers in 5 schools in the area and tried to convince some of them in a group called the Empathic Norms Condition that empathy was cool, that it would help them navigate their social lives. We played them videos. Here, I'll show you a snippet of one.
Specifically, seventh graders tend to like empathy more, meaning that they want to be empathic. They also value empathy in others, meaning that they like it when other people are empathic and want to be friends with empathic people. Finally, they expect empathy from others, meaning that in seventh grade, most people are empathic. And now more than ever, you and your seventh grade peers are better able to share and understand each other's emotions.
So after playing them these videos, we asked students to describe why they valued empathy. We then collated all their responses. Why? So that later on, we could present students with a brochure of all their friends and classmates saying why they valued empathy. In other words, we were pointing them to a real social norm all around them that they might not have been aware of, the popularity of empathy among their peers. After that, we asked them to describe how people in their grade felt about empathy, and students were really enthusiastic. Here's one response. A student wrote, "People in my grade feel very strongly about empathy. It's really important to value empathy, and I can see that many people in my grade value it a lot." Smiley face emoji, which, as far as I understand, is the most enthusiastic a seventh grader can get. So hearing that other people around them valued empathy made these kids say that they valued empathy. Did it make them act more empathically? Well, to examine that, we followed up 2 months later. We returned to these schools and asked students to nominate kids in their class who were nice, who helped other people, or seemed caring. And what we found is that students in our empathic norms condition, who had told that other people valued empathy, came to believe that empathy was popular among their classmates, and that belief in turn predicted their likelihood of acting kindly. Not telling us that they acted kindly, but other students telling us that they acted kindly, which to us is a more convincing measure. This to us is an uplifting study, but even more, I think it has sort of implications that go far beyond education. I think in our culture, sometimes the loudest voices that we have are not always the kindest. Think about these seventh graders. They might be paying attention to a bully. Or think about extreme pundits on cable news, or your favorite loud, mean person on Twitter. Now, these people might not represent the majority, but they take up so much airspace that it's easy to believe that they do, and to feel that if we're going to fit in, we should fall in line with a cruel and callous culture. But in fact, there might be a quieter, empathic majority all around us. People who are kind, but just not speaking up about it. So what I often tell people is, if you want to change that, make your empathy loud and make other people's empathy loud too. Because that increases the chance that people will not just see your kindness, other people's kindness, but that they'll be drawn towards it, that it'll become magnetic and contagious. The last insight that I want to leave you with is that simply understanding that we can build empathy is the first step towards doing it. Some of you might be familiar with my colleague Carol Dweck and her idea of mindsets. This is the notion that our beliefs about ourselves change the way that we deal with challenges. For instance, Carol famously found that children who believed that intelligence was a fixed trait were less likely to engage with challenging intellectual problems, whereas students who believed that they could grow their intelligence were eager to work on those problems to help themselves develop. When I got to Stanford, Carol and I decided to see whether the same was true of empathy. In particular, we tried to convince people that empathy was either a trait or a skill. We had some people read this essay. Empathy, like plaster, is pretty stable over time, which meant, again, to convince them that empathy was a trait. Other people read this essay. Empathy is changeable and can be developed. After having people read one or the other of these essays, we put them through an empathic obstacle course full of situations where sometimes caring and connection don't come naturally. What we found over and over again is that people we had just convinced that empathy was a skill worked harder at it. For instance, they spent more time listening to the stories of someone from a different race and more energy trying to understand the experiences of someone they disagreed with politically. Now, this again to us is optimistic. I think it's also ironic, though. I've just told you that standard wisdom is the Roddenberry hypothesis, the idea that empathy is a trait. Well, it turns out that believing that might not just be wrong, it might be counterproductive, because it might demotivate us from trying at empathy and tempt us to empathize instead in whatever narrow or easy ways that come naturally to us. But hopefully by now you know that empathy is a skill and that you have the opportunity, and I would say the responsibility, to align it with your values and who you want to be. And that's what I want to leave you with. One last time, let's return to our ancient friend here. Yes, maybe his social world made connecting with others easier than our modern life. But this person's life was different from ours in like a million different ways. For one, it probably took him lots of time and energy to just get enough calories to survive the day. Evolving in that situation might have made evolving in that situation sort of caused people to develop tastes for calorically dense foods like fat, sugar, and salt. But those same tastes might be miscalibrated to our modern context because now we can live sedentary lives and we're surrounded by calorically dense foods. Now you could say, well, I guess my ancient instincts are miscalibrated with my modern context and just give up. But a lot of us don't do that. We, for instance, try to eat healthy or exercise, not because it comes easily, it certainly doesn't for me, but because that's what we want to do and that's who we want to be. I want to challenge all of us to think of our empathy in the same way, to focus our care on people without a voice and focus our curiosity on people who are different from us, to empathize, especially when it's hard, because we know it can make us better people. If you do that, well, then you can benefit from empathy's many positive qualities, and the people around you can too. But if many of us can do that, well, then we can then something bigger can happen. We can begin to reclaim our common humanity and rebuild our empathy and maybe mend some of the tears in our social fabric. And that's the good news here. Empathy is not just a precious resource, it is also a renewable one. Thank you.
Jamil, thanks so much. Very, very interesting topic. I'm also a big fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation, so if there was at least one other person
thank
on.
God, Zach. It only takes one, really. I feel so much solidarity with you. Now, before we jump into questions, sorry about this. I just have to step out for just 1 minute. Is that okay?
Sure.
I will be right back.
Everyone, we're going to jump into questions. Jamil just had to step away for 1 second here. Again, if we've gotten a few questions already, other folks who have questions for Jamil, please enter them in the Ask a Question link in the resources section of the page. And we'll just sit tight for 1 moment here.
So sorry about that, everybody. Sick kid at home, and just wanted to make sure everything was okay.
No problem, Jamil. Great. Well, I can kick us off with a couple questions that we've received so far. And again, people are welcome. We've got several minutes here to have some Q&A, which is great. One question is just someone saying they're a bit surprised. You talked about how social media has this potential to create such a more empathetic world, but they sort of see it, and you touched on this also, that there's so much negativity on social media and in the news, and that's kind of what people tend to fixate on, and that seems to create this idea that people just stop caring. There's too much to possibly process that's wrong in the world. Can you touch on those two kind of competing viewpoints? Has your research found anything in that, so we can kind of better understand how to utilize the tools we have and maybe avoid some of the things that maybe be bringing us down?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that it's important here to distinguish between the way that the internet and social media are and what they could be. So the person who has the question is totally right that the way that social media is currently constituted seems to be geared towards negativity, vanity, extremism, etc. And that's because many of our biggest online platforms are not designed to help people be happy or connected to each other. They're designed to keep people online by whatever means necessary, which often means appealing to our weaknesses rather than our strengths. So there's all sorts of work, and I wrote an article in Scientific American about this that people can find, or I can share with folks if they like, that's all about this. But I mean, many of the algorithms that sort of in a blind way try to figure out what causes people to scroll longer or click longer end up showing them really negative stuff, because negative stuff is very sticky. Negative content and fear and loathing and and narcissism are powerful forces in our psyche. And so if you show a bunch of people that, they will stay online and feel totally overwhelmed and really terrible. And that's what is happening now. But that's not what it has to be. And there are other social networks and websites that have different incentive structures, that have different algorithms, that are meant not to sort of sell ads, but rather to really connect people. And those sites actually give us a model, I think, of what the internet could be. What I think it was supposed to be, by the way, when, like, if you read Wired from 2010 or whatever, the way that people were breathlessly saying that we'd have a sort of global town square. And so I think that there are opportunities online. I don't think that we've taken them. But that is not the same as saying that being online necessarily makes us less empathic or less connected.
Great. Jamil, thanks for that. Another question, and this is broad, but just looking for specific ideas to focus on in day-to-day life to improve empathy, specific exercises, that sort of thing, besides just thinking I want to be more empathic.
Yeah, so I mean, that's, not to plug it too much, but that's basically what my book is about. But some things that are sort of tried and true. One is certain types of meditation practice. So things like loving kindness or compassion meditation have been demonstrated over and over again to help people build their empathic muscle, and even to change their brain along the way. I think engagement with the arts is a sleeper, right? Sort of way to train in empathy. There's all sorts of evidence that the more fiction that people read and theater that they attend, the more empathic they become, which, by the way, is one of the reasons I think arts education is so undervalued, because we think of it as just exposure to art when really it's training in psychology. And the third, and I mentioned this briefly, is cultivating diverse friendships. Really making an effort to get to know, not just be exposed to, but get to know individuals who are different from ourselves. Great.
And Jamil, just this question is sort of a follow-up coming from me personally. Just wondering, you mentioned theater. I'm just wondering, do people who watch movies that are more empathetic, does that or that highlight, other cultures, things like that, or other perspectives, is that been proved to be helpful, or is that medium somehow different compared to like live theater?
There's less evidence. There's no evidence, in fact, that I know of about movies in particular, except my lab is working with a film company right now to test the empathy building effects of a film I cannot name, but a sort of film that's coming out soon that I think will is very empathy positive. So we'll stay tuned for that, please.
Very, very interesting. A question here asking specifically about perspective taking and how it fits into the broader concept of empathy. And just asking, is perspective taking one component of empathy, and can it be used to actually build empathy across social groups?
That's a great question. Very well-informed question. And yes, perspective. So you might remember that I talked about 3 pieces of empathy: sharing other people's emotions, understanding them, and caring about them. Perspective taking is basically an exercise in cognitive empathy, or understanding what someone else feels. And there's lots of evidence that perspective taking exercises are a great way to build empathy, including for groups or for individuals and groups who are different from ourselves. So Dan Batson is sort of like the godfather of this part of the field, and he's done like umpteen million studies demonstrating the power of perspective taking in this regard.
Great. Just one or two questions left. Again, if anyone else on the webinar has questions, please enter them. There's actually been 2 or 3 questions, but just asking about empathy on teams. As particular, one question is related to more like sales teams, another's just more general for the people that they work with to be more empathetic with clients and each other. Obviously, as you mentioned, I guess empathy can be contagious, but how to maybe encourage that if you're in the manager role, or if you're not, how to kind of make that as contagious as possible, I suppose, in addition to working on your personal empathy.
That's a terrific question, and one that I've thought a lot about. In fact, I have a couple of pieces recently, one in the Harvard Business Review and another essay on LinkedIn about empathy in the workplace and how to create more empathic cultures there. The first thing to realize is that oftentimes we get it totally backwards. We have a hyper individualistic notion often, and especially, though not exclusively in the business world, that success requires ruthless individualism, that we need to compete with everybody around us, and that giving to others means sort of sacrificing our own success. The opposite is true. I mean, there's all sorts of evidence in teams, both in the workplace, and I'll also add athletic teams as well, that more interconnected groups succeed. There's a great quote from Bill Bradley, who was part of the 1972 championship Knicks team, who said that the success of the team ensures the success of the individual, but not the other way around. In other words, a bunch of team players who are there for each other will all thrive more than a bunch of hyper-individualistic competitors who are just looking out for number one. I think that realization is so important for leaders and often tricky for them to really internalize. A lot of leaders these days sing the praises of empathy, put it up on the wall as a corporate value, but don't necessarily know how to make it real on the ground. I think there's a bunch of things that people can do. One is to model empathy from the top. Another is to reward not just individual performance, but cooperation, collaboration, and helping among people's staff, sort of recognize it, elevate it, and incentivize it. And a third is to create programs that allow people to, in material ways, help each other. So there's one technique that I really like called peer-to-peer bonus systems, where employees are given resources that they can't spend on themselves, but have to gift to each other. And it turns out that teams who are given peer-to-peer bonus systems are more effective, have greater morale, and that type of program creates reverberations throughout a company, sort of building kindness as a culture. So there's lots of things to do. It's crucially very important for managers to understand this. And in fact, I work with a lot of companies on exactly that effort.
Great. And the last question that we have so far is just about helping to raise empathetic children. Any particular things at particular ages? I'm sure that's a huge subject, but kind of high-level thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, as having 2 young children myself, I think about this a lot. And again, I mean, I think that part of parenting, you're really creating a world for your kid, at least for the first several years. And I think that a big question is, what do you do? What type of person are you? What do you value in life? What do you notice in life? Because that's the model that your children will follow. So oftentimes, in my own family, we try to focus on what we're grateful for. We try to recognize and reward kindness in ourselves and in others. And we try to talk about why, excuse me, why kindness is so powerful and helpful in general. And I think, again, sort of the same way that we're responsible for the culture of our business, we're also responsible for the culture of our family. And we have a lot of power in dictating what that culture looks like. Excuse me. Sorry, like I said, a little bit under the weather. But those were great questions.
Great. Jamil, thank you so much. I certainly hope you feel better. I also hope people are able to use these ideas to help increase empathy in their own lives and communities. The recording will be available for people online, and again, the link to the book is in the resources section. Jamil, I may also ask you if you can send us the links to some of the articles you mentioned. We can include those in the resources for the recording, so people can have access to those as well. And then people can also register for upcoming webinars on our upcoming events page. So thank you everyone so much for attending. Thanks again, Jamil, and everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thanks very much.